You look at those buildings over there, those glass towers, and you understand something real fast. They weren't built for you, so you build something for yourself. That line, attributed to Darius Pressley by multiple associates who heard him speak it on more than one occasion, tells you nearly everything you need to know about the psychology that would come to define 8 years of organized crack distribution in southeast Raleigh, North Carolina. It tells you about the clarity he had, the bitterness that had calcified into something harder and more purposeful, and it tells you about the central contradiction that would eventually consume him, that a man so sharp in his reading of the world around him could be so blind to the world closing in around him. How far will a human being go to achieve a goal they've convinced themselves is righteous? How far will they go when the righteousness is borrowed from a genuine wound? The summer of 1991 in Raleigh was the kind of summer that made the city's contradictions impossible to ignore. The heat settled into the southeast corridor differently than it did in other parts of town. In North Hills, in Cameron Village, in the neighborhoods that fanned out northward toward the Research Triangle Park, the heat was something you managed. With central air conditioning, with pools in the backyard, with an afternoon drive in a car that worked reliably. In the blocks around Pool Road, around Rock Quarry Road, around the neighborhoods that pressed up against the southeastern edge of the city proper, the heat was something you inhabited, and it sat in the apartments where 2 or 3 families shared space to split the rent. It radiated off the asphalt of parking lots outside convenience stores where men stood in the late morning because there was nowhere better to be. You could drive 25 minutes north on 40 and stand in the shadow of corporate campuses that were quietly reshaping the American economy. Then you could drive 25 minutes back and stand on a porch in Raleigh's southeast corridor and watch a community absorbing a decade of economic neglect with the particular silence of people who had learned not to expect rescue. Darius Pressley was 22 years old that summer, and he had been paying attention to that contrast for most of his life. And he grew up in southeast Raleigh at a time when the neighborhood's slow erosion was well underway, but not yet fully understood by the institutions that might have arrested it. His mother, Carolyn Pressley, worked a cleaning job at a hotel near the airport and supplemented that income with whatever informal domestic work she could find in the weeks between paychecks. His father, a man whose presence in Darius's life was intermittent and ultimately absent, left when Darius was 7. The absence was not dramatic. No explosive final argument. No cinematic departure. According to Carolyn, he simply stopped coming back. Darius absorbed that disappearance in the way that children absorb foundational losses, quietly, and in a way that shapes everything that follows without announcing itself. Teachers at the elementary school he attended remembered him as perceptive and distractible in roughly equal measure. One former teacher, speaking years later to investigators, described him as a child who seemed to be running 2 parallel tracks of thought at all times, one following the lesson, one somewhere else entirely. He was not a poor student in the sense of lacking capability. He was a student who had decided at some point in his early adolescence that the capability the school was trying to develop was not pointing toward anything useful for a person in his specific circumstances. That decision, and it does appear to have been a conscious decision, crystallized somewhere around the 8th grade, when Darius began spending increasing amounts of time with older boys in the neighborhood who had already made the same calculation. By 15, he was running small errands. By 17, he understood the geography of the local trade with the kind of granular precision that would have made him genuinely exceptional in any logistics operation. He knew which blocks moved, which time of day, which customers paid reliably, which ones would negotiate, and which ones were dangerous. He developed what people around him consistently described as an almost academic commitment to understanding how systems worked. Not just the street systems. He read whatever he came across. He was known to carry paperback books in the same jacket pockets where he kept his money. Associates recalled him talking about business concepts with the facility of someone who had actually studied them, which in an informal sense he had. The transition from participant to architect came gradually and then very quickly, in the way of most significant shifts. By 1990, Darius Pressley had relationships with suppliers in the Charlotte market, a functional understanding of how to insulate himself from street-level exposure, and crucially, a reputation among people in Southeast Raleigh as someone who was serious. Not violent in the casual, performative way that characterized some of his peers, but serious. People who worked around him during this period consistently described a quality of self-possession that read, to those in his orbit, as leadership. He was not loud, and he did not swagger in the ways that tend to attract premature law enforcement attention. He was, by multiple accounts, calm in a way that occasionally unnerved the people around him. What he was building through 1991 and into 1992 was a crack distribution network that operated across a defined geographic territory in southeast Raleigh. The network was organized in layers, with Pressley insulated from direct street transactions by multiple intermediary figures. He sourced from suppliers, distributed to lieutenants, and maintained discipline through a combination of financial reliability. He paid on time, every time, which in the informal economy is a virtue that commands enormous loyalty, and the subtle but unmistakable implication that disruption of his operation would carry consequences. There is no evidence in the federal case record that Pressley personally ordered or carried out violence during the early years of his operation. There is substantial evidence that he did not need to because his reputation was managed with sufficient care that the need rarely arose. The customers his organization served were, in the main, residents of the same southeast Raleigh neighborhoods where he had grown up. This is a fact that the federal prosecution would later emphasize, and that Pressley's defense would attempt to reframe. The crack epidemic had hit communities like his with the force of something specifically engineered for destruction, which some people at the time argued, with varying degrees of evidence, that it was. Whether engineered or emergent, its effect on southeast Raleigh through the late 1980s and into the 1990s was devastating, in the particular slow-motion way that chemical dependency devastates communities. First the individuals, then the families, then the social fabric that had held the neighborhood together across multiple generations. Darius Pressley did not create these conditions. He read them, and he built a business inside them. The moral weight of that distinction is something the courts, the community, and history have weighed differently. By 1993, the operation had reached a scale that brought it to the serious attention of the Raleigh Police Department's Narcotics Division. The department had been tracking elevated crack activity in the southeast corridor for some time, but the organization's layered structure made it difficult to identify a center of gravity. Street-level arrests produced arrests and prosecutions of street-level operators. The supply and the money continued to flow. A detective named Raymond Hollister, who would become one of the central figures in the investigation that eventually brought Pressley down, later described the early period of the investigation in terms that conveyed genuine professional frustration. "We knew there was an organization," he said in a court filing. "We could see the shape of it in the patterns. We just couldn't find the room where the decisions were being made." The organization's operational discipline was, by the standards of comparable operations in similar markets, genuinely impressive. Pressley had established clear protocols around communication. He was an early adapter to the use of pagers and public phones in rotation, and a technique that was common at the time but that he applied with unusual consistency. He held meetings rarely, and when he did, never in the same location twice. He maintained a legitimate-seeming economic profile, He had a documented involvement in a small detailing business that provided sufficient explanation for a lifestyle that was, by the standards of Southeast Raleigh in the early 1990s, comfortable without being conspicuous. He drove a used Buick Regal. He did not wear jewelry that announced his position. Multiple federal agents who worked the case would later describe a consistent theme in their early surveillance. Pressley was difficult to see. What made him visible, ultimately, was the nature of sustained law enforcement attention over time, combined with the internal frictions that develop in any human organization, regardless of how well it is structured. The frictions began to manifest seriously around 1994. A lieutenant named Corey Langston, who had been with the organization since near its founding, developed a crack dependency himself, a pattern not uncommon in operations whose primary product is crack cocaine, and one that Pressley had reportedly attempted to guard against through explicit prohibitions on use by his own people. Langston's use made him unreliable, and unreliability in his position created exposure. According to later testimony, Pressley addressed this through a combination of reduced responsibility and increased surveillance of Langston's activities. What he did not do, for reasons that appear to have been partly pragmatic and partly personal, Langston and Pressley had known each other since childhood, was remove him from the organization entirely. That decision would prove to be among the most consequential Pressley ever made. The Raleigh Police Department's investigation deepened through 1994 and 1995 with the addition of federal partnership, as the Drug Enforcement Administration became involved based on evidence of interstate supply connections. Detective Hollister began working directly with a DEA agent named Patricia Garner, a pairing that would shape the next several years of the case. Garner's approach was methodical in a way that complemented Hollister's more street-level intelligence network. Get where Hollister knew the geography of the Southeast Corridor and the human relationships that animated it. Garner focused on money, on the financial patterns that any operation of Pressley's scale necessarily produced, and that, however carefully managed, left evidence in the institutions of the formal economy. What Garner found, working backward through financial records, property transactions, and business filings, was a picture of an organization that was generating substantial revenue. Estimates at trial would place the operation's gross proceeds over the course of its existence in the range of several $1,000,000. And that was moving a portion of that revenue through the detailing business and through a series of informal loans to family members and associates that would later be characterized as structured to avoid detection thresholds. The financial picture was not airtight, but it was coherent, and it established a documentary foundation beneath what had been primarily a street intelligence case. Pressley, during this period, continued to operate with what appears from the outside to have been genuine confidence in his insulation. People who interacted with him in the mid-1990s described a man who was, if anything, more composed than he had been in the earlier years. He had a long-term relationship with a woman named Tamara Fields, with whom he had a daughter born in 1993. He was described by neighbors as a present and attentive father, which is a fact that both complicates the simple narrative and accurately reflects the genuinely compartmentalized nature of the life he was living. The man who organized crack distribution across a significant portion of Southeast Raleigh coached his daughter's t-ball team on Saturday mornings. Both things were true simultaneously, and the simultaneous truth of them is important to the psychology of this case. The first major contradiction that would surface in the federal investigation emerged from the financial records Garner assembled. Pressley's documented income from the detailing business, combined with a second small venture he had started in 1994, was simply inconsistent with his actual expenditures and the funds flowing through accounts connected to him, even accounting for informal cash transactions. The gap was not enormous. He had been careful, but it was persistent and documentable across multiple tax years. When federal investigators later confronted this in proceedings, Pressley's explanation involved a claimed inheritance from a deceased uncle, a claim that investigators were unable to verify, and that family members, when interviewed, offered inconsistent accounts of. The inheritance story was not provably false, but it was unprovable as true, and its appearance as an explanatory device at precisely the moment it was needed registered as significant to investigators who had been watching the case's architecture for years. The second contradiction emerged from Corey Langston. By 1996, Langston's situation had deteriorated to the point where he was making decisions consistent with someone who understood his position in the organization to be compromised and his personal freedom to be at risk. He had been arrested on a possession charge in late 1995, a charge that he had managed through a lawyer paid for by money that, investigators would later argue, traced back to Pressley. The arrest had brought him into contact with investigators who made clear, in terms they described as explicit, that the possession charge was not their primary interest. Langston did not cooperate immediately. What he did was begin making a series of decisions that suggested he was calculating his options. Detective Hollister later described the period between Langston's arrest and his formal cooperation as one of the most delicate phases of the entire investigation. "He wasn't there yet," Hollister said in a later deposition. "But you could see him getting there, and part of the work was not rushing it, not pushing so hard that he either flipped back or created a situation that compromised the case." Langston eventually entered into a cooperation agreement in mid-1996 after a second arrest on a distribution charge that carried mandatory minimum exposure, serious enough to recalibrate his calculation definitively. What Langston provided was significant on multiple levels, and he had direct knowledge of the organization's structure from the inside, knowledge that confirmed and filled in the picture. Investigators had been assembling from the outside. He could speak to specific transactions, specific meetings, specific decisions that Pressley had made about the operation's direction. He could identify suppliers and customers and the financial mechanisms that connected them. He was, in the vocabulary of federal prosecutions, a cooperating witness of potentially exceptional value. He was also Corey Langston, a man with a crack dependency, a history of arrests, a personal relationship with the subject of the investigation going back to childhood, and every possible motive, in the eyes of a skilled defense attorney, to say whatever served his immediate interests. The value of his cooperation was real, and the vulnerabilities of it were equally real, and the prosecution knew both things going in. The third major contradiction, the one that would prove most difficult for Pressley's eventual defense to navigate, came from the financial investigation's intersection with a property purchase Pressley had made in 1995. He had bought a house in a section of southeast Raleigh that was marginally more stable than the blocks where his operation ran, paying in a manner that involved a combination of documented down payment funds and what was described in the transaction records as a private loan. The private loan came from an individual who, when investigators traced the connection, turned out to be a peripheral figure in the organization's supply chain. And the documentation of the loan was formal. There was paperwork, signed and notarized, but the terms were anomalous in ways that a forensic accountant retained by the DEA identified with considerable precision. The interest rate was below market. The repayment schedule was irregular. Most significantly, there was no documented evidence of any prior financial relationship between Pressley and the lender of a kind that would have made such a loan to this specific borrower on these specific terms, at this specific moment, make economic sense outside the context of the organization they both had reasons to maintain. This was not, by itself, a smoking gun, but it was a thread, and investigators had been pulling threads for years. The public face of the research triangle through the mid-1990s was one of confident, upward-moving prosperity. IBM, Glaxo, SAS Institute. The names attached to campuses north of the city represented exactly the kind of high-wage, knowledge economy employment that characterized what economists were calling the new American growth model. Raleigh was profiled in national publications as a model of Southern urbanism done right. The educational infrastructure, the quality of life metrics, the forward momentum of the place. These were real, and they were genuinely impressive by many measures. They were also almost entirely inaccessible to the residents of the Southeast Corridor in any practical sense. This is not a polemical observation. It is the conclusion that federal prosecutors themselves would reach in the context of the Pressley case, and it is borne out by the economic data of the period. Employment in the research triangle's dominant sectors required educational credentials that the schools serving Southeast Raleigh were, by the evidence of their own outcomes during this period, not consistently producing. The geographic and transportation infrastructure connecting Southeast Raleigh to the triangle's employment centers was, at best, inadequate. Capital access for small business development in the corridor was constrained in ways that federal fair lending investigations of the period were beginning to document. The prosperity was visible. The pathways to it were, for most of the Southeast Corridor's residents, theoretical at best. Pressley understood this. By multiple accounts, he spoke about it regularly, and with a coherence that struck people in his orbit as unusual. The ability to describe a systemic condition in analytical terms, while simultaneously operating a business that exploited that condition's most vulnerable human products. That tension is not a paradox exactly. It is more like the kind of clarity that comes without the consolation of not knowing. He knew what he was doing and where he was doing it. He had decided that the alternative was worse. This is the part of his psychology that the prosecution, in its public statements around the case, attempted to address with some seriousness. The lead federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chen, gave an extended statement at a press conference following the indictment that went considerably beyond the standard recitation of charges. Chen argued explicitly that the Pressley case illustrated the predictable consequence of economic growth that systematically excluded specific communities. "We are not suggesting that economic exclusion excuses what Mr. Pressley built," Chen said. "We are suggesting that what Mr. Pressley built was not accidental. It was rational, from the perspective of someone with his options. And until we reckon with the conditions that made it rational, we will continue producing the same outcomes." It was an unusual statement for a federal prosecutor to make, and it received substantial coverage in both the Raleigh News and Observer and in several national publications tracking the broader conversation about crack enforcement policy that was intensifying through the late 1990s. The statement also, somewhat inadvertently, it gave the defense a framework it would attempt to use at trial. Pressley's attorney, a skilled defense lawyer named Howard Briggs, who had been practicing in the Eastern District for nearly 2 decades, argued in pretrial filings and in opening statements that the government's own framing acknowledged the role of systemic failure in producing the conditions the prosecution was attributing to his client's individual moral agency. It was a sophisticated argument, and it landed with the jury with approximately the force that most sophisticated arguments land in federal narcotics conspiracy trials. Which is to say, it was heard, it was noted, and it was ultimately insufficient. The trial began in the spring of 1999, 8 years after the operation Pressley had built from conversations in the heat of Southeast Raleigh summer mornings. By the time the jury was seated, investigators had assembled a case that contained financial documentation spanning 6 years. The testimony of Corey Langston and 3 other cooperating witnesses, surveillance records from multiple phases of the investigation, and the forensic financial analysis that traced money through the detailing business and into the property transactions and family loans that form the operation's economic skeleton. Langston's testimony was the emotional center of the trial in the way that insider testimony almost always is. He described the organization from the inside, the early conversations in which Pressley had laid out his vision with the kind of systematic clarity that distinguished his operation from the improvised hustles that characterized most street-level operations at his scale. He described specific transactions and specific decisions. He described the meeting sometime in 1994, in which Pressley had outlined what he called the principles of the organization. A list that Langston recalled included paying people what they were owed without delay, never using the product, never putting anything in writing that didn't need to be, and never giving law enforcement anything that could not be explained by a legitimate seeming reality. Langston was on the stand for 3 days. Briggs's cross-examination was long and relentless, and succeeded in establishing, for the record, every vulnerability in Langston's credibility that was available to establish. Briggs could not, however, reach the underlying facts Langston described, because those facts were corroborated in too many places by evidence that had nothing to do with Corey Langston. The financial analyst's testimony, a forensic accountant named Sandra Kim, who had worked the case with Garner, was in some ways more devastating than Langston's, because it was data rather than memory. Kim walked the jury through 6 years of financial records with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the story the numbers told would only be convincing if the jury could follow it in real time. By the time she finished, the organization's economic reality was visible in documentary form in a way that no amount of cross-examination could fully dissolve. Pressley did not testify. Briggs had made that decision early, and it was the correct decision given what the prosecution had assembled. There was nothing Pressley could have said that would have helped more than the invocation of his Fifth Amendment rights, and there was a great deal he could have said, in response to a skilled prosecutor's cross-examination, that would have hurt significantly. The jury heard the government's case without having to weigh it against a live defendant, and they heard it anyway. The verdict came back after 4 days of deliberation. Guilty on the primary conspiracy count, guilty on the money laundering counts that attached to the property transactions, guilty on several of the supporting charges that detailed the organization's operation at various points, not guilty on 2 of the more peripheral charges that the prosecution had included, perhaps overconfidently, in the indictment. It was not a total victory for the government, but it was a comprehensive one. Sentencing took place several months later, in a courtroom that drew a substantial audience from the southeast Raleigh community, which had been following the case with the kind of divided attention that communities apply to figures who have simultaneously exploited and in some ways sustained them. Pressley stood for sentencing with the same composure he had apparently maintained throughout his adult life in public settings. Judge William Harrington delivered a sentence of 22 years in federal prison, applying the mandatory minimums that attached to the drug weight established at trial and the enhancement that came with the leadership role finding. Harrington made a statement from the bench that was, like Chen's earlier press conference, somewhat unusual in its scope, and he acknowledged the structural arguments the defense had raised. He said that the court was not equipped to remedy the conditions that preceded the conduct it was sentencing, but that it was required to sentence the conduct. He said he hoped the community of Southeast Raleigh would receive the investment it deserved. Then he sentenced Darius Pressley to 22 years. Corey Langston, who had entered his cooperation agreement before the indictment, and whose testimony had been assessed by the prosecution as material and credible, received a reduced sentence of 8 years on the charges to which he had pleaded guilty. He served his time and was released in the mid-2000s. By accounts available from community members, He remained in the Raleigh area and maintained a low profile. His crack dependency, in which had been the friction point that opened the case to outside pressure, was addressed through treatment available to him during his incarceration. Tamara Fields, Pressley's partner and the mother of his daughter, was not charged. Investigators had examined her financial circumstances carefully and concluded that she had not had sufficient knowledge of or involvement in the organization's operations to meet the threshold for charges. She continued living in southeast Raleigh with their daughter, who was 6 years old at the time of her father's sentencing. Tamara gave a statement to a Raleigh newspaper in the weeks following the verdict in which she described a man who had, in the intimate space of family life, been present and attentive and genuinely loving toward his child. She did not contest the verdict. She did not argue that the wrong person had been convicted. What she said, which the reporter who conducted the interview noted seemed to cost her something to say, was that the two realities, the father she knew and the operation the jury had just convicted, were both true simultaneously, and that she was not able to resolve them, and that she was not sure resolution was the right word for what she was looking for. Of the other associates who formed the organization's operating layer, most faced charges in the proceeding that ran parallel to the primary case. Several accepted plea agreements. 2 contested their charges at trial and were convicted. The sentences ranged from 5 to 15 years, depending on role, charges, and cooperation credit. The organization itself ceased to function as an organized entity with Pressley's arrest in 1998 and the arrest of the remaining leadership structure in the months that followed. The geography it had operated in did not change appreciably. The demand it had served did not disappear. The structural conditions that had made the Southeast Corridor a market did not change, though the late 1990s and early 2000s would see the beginning of some investment in the area that had not been present before. Darius Pressley served his sentence in the federal system, eventually becoming eligible for release consideration as the sentencing reforms of subsequent decades modified the mandatory minimum landscape for drug offenses. His case was cited in academic work examining the intersection of economic inequality and crack distribution networks in southern cities, and in at least one law review article examining the structural arguments raised in his prosecution. His attorney, Howard Briggs, gave a lecture at a North Carolina law school several years after the trial, in which he described the Pressley case as the one that had most challenged his ability to define what justice looked like in a courtroom. He said he believed Pressley was guilty of the charges as charged. He said he also believed the prosecution's own framing had contained the most accurate diagnosis of why the case existed that anyone in the proceeding had offered. The research triangle continued its upward trajectory through the late 1990s and into the 21st century, becoming one of the most significant technology and life sciences corridors in the United States. The Southeast Raleigh corridor remained, for most of the period that followed, a community whose relationship to that prosperity remained complicated in the ways that Pressley had described from the porches and corners where he had built his operation. Investment came, eventually, and in various forms. The community's relationship to the growth around it remained a live civic question in Raleigh for decades after the case closed. There is a version of the story of Darius Pressley that is simple and satisfying. A man with choices made the wrong ones, built something destructive, hurt his community, and paid the price. That version is not false. Yet the choices were real and they were consequential, and the harm they produced in Southeast Raleigh, in the families of people who developed dependencies, in the children who grew up in the operational territory, in the community's relationship to law enforcement that sustained itself through this period and after, is not diminished by any structural context you layer beneath it. But the story is not only that version. The man who stood up in quiet corners of Southeast Raleigh and talked about glass towers not built for you was not confabulating a justification in the moment. He was describing something real. To the question his case raises, the question federal prosecutor Chen raised in public, and that Judge Harrington raised from the bench, and that Briggs raised in a law school lecture, is not whether Pressley's understanding of his circumstances excuses the organization he built. It does not. The question is what it means that his understanding was accurate, and that his response to accurate understanding of genuine exclusion was to build something that accelerated his community's destruction, using the community's own most vulnerable members as raw material. That question is not answerable in a courtroom, and it was not answered in the courtroom where Darius Pressley was sentenced. It is the kind of question that persists after the verdict, after the sentencing, after the organization's dissolution, after the newspaper coverage has moved on to the next thing. It is the kind of question that the Southeast Raleigh community that watched all of this happen was left holding while the Research Triangle's glass towers continued to rise in the distance, visible from the front porches where, if you stood at the right angle, in the right light, you could see exactly what you were not part of. How far will a human being go to achieve a goal they've convinced themselves is righteous? Far enough to build something real. Far enough to sustain it for 8 years against the pressure of law enforcement attention and internal friction, and the fundamental instability of any system built on the chemical dependency of its own customers. Far enough that when the walls finally closed in, the organization had processed enough money and moved enough product and occupied enough of the life of a specific community that its dismantling left a visible shape in the neighborhood, not the shape of something repaired, but the shape of something that had been and was now absent. The distinction matters. Pressley understood from the beginning that he was building inside a wound in the American city. What he may not have fully accounted for, what the long arc of his case suggests he may have held at some psychological distance, is that building inside a wound, however rationally, deepens it. The towers don't move. The wound gets larger. And the man who convinced himself he was responding to the world as it was given to him ended his working years in a federal prison while the community he had claimed to understand continued absorbing the consequences of what he had built inside it. That is the full weight of it, not the simple weight of crime and punishment, though that weight is real. The full weight of intelligence applied in a direction that consumed the people it claimed to understand, of clarity without mercy, of a man who could read a system with precision and then became one of its most effective instruments. The question of how far a human will go does not have a comfortable answer here. It has an accurate one,